Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here, as always, with my friend, comrade, and co-host, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. What is up, Tim?
What is up, Brian? Anything happening in the world?
Quiet, all quiet here.
Quiet,
All
good.
quiet in DC.
So we're done.
Yeah, we're done. We don't have it's a short episode today. Nothing's really happened last week. Thanks to everyone for joining us. A little bit of gallows humor from us at this point because my gosh, what a week this has been. We are recording this on Monday, February 28th. I will give all credit to my friend Mr. O'Toole, who this earlier today said, I think last week was the most significant week in the history of economic sanctions, which may very well be the case. Time will tell, I think. But my word, we have been just completely running on the hamster wheel for the last week plus with everything that's going on in Ukraine at the moment. And that is, surprise, surprise, what we're going to spend the entire episode talking about today. Yeah, it's just before we get started, any initial thoughts, wisdom, comments you want to share with the people, the good people out there,
It's
Tim?
just been exhausting, but I mean, it's exhausting for the world and not just from a sanctions perspective.
Yeah, obviously not to make light of the fact that we're talking about serious loss of life and, you know, a blatant disregard for um, a sovereign nation here and its people. But as a result of that, that is what we're about to talk about is trying to fight against, is trying to actually deter and curtail and stop all of that from happening. We will debate whether we're on the right track there or not, but it is. My gosh, it has been a wild ride the last week or so.
Even the Swiss cannot remain neutral on this issue, which I think says a lot.
Good, good point. Our good friends. Hats off to our friends in Switzerland for getting in the mix. Before we get started, the normal preliminary messages that we are not giving legal advice. We are not sharing any confidential information. Any and all opinions that you hear today are mine and Tim's. If you don't like them or disagree with them, please blame us. If you like the pod, please spread the word. And please subscribe. Please give us a rating. Hopefully a 5-star rating. You can get us anywhere you find your pod content. So the agenda and the roadmap today are pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Russia. We're talking about Russia, and we're talking about the tsunami of sanctions that have been levied against Russia in the past week by the US, the EU, and many others around the world, and what that has done, what that amounts to, what may be coming, what hasn't happened yet. There's frankly, we could have probably a 5-hour podcast if we really wanted to on this. I think we don't want to put everybody to sleep, and Tim and I need to sleep at some point today, presumably, hopefully, unlike the past few days. So we're not going to do that to all of you. As we tend to do, we're going to talk about some themes and some higher level elements of what has been announced so far by the U.S. and the global community to combat what's going on in Ukraine right now. We're going to kind of roughly organize things in 2 parts. We're going to start with economic sanctions, and then we're going to move on to export controls. But that is it. We are just covering Russia, and we're going to cover the many different, most of the relevant subtopics thereunder in a fairly brisk, hopefully about 45-minute conversation that we're going to have here. And then we are going to have a lightning round topic because buried within all of the Russian news in the past week was the news and the announcement that DOJ is mothballing the China initiative, at least in its current iteration. So we are going to spend maybe 5 minutes talking about that at the tail end in the lightning round. But otherwise, this is an all Russia episode, and that is what we're going to focus on. So before we jump in, Tim, any final thoughts, or should we go ahead and get
Let's
after it?
jump into this. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get after it. So for those that have been asleep for the past week, the invasion of Ukraine began in earnest just over a week ago by Russia, and the U.S. and the global community have responded in many, many different ways over the last several days. And so we'll sort of briefly catalog those here. I'm not going to get into all of the aspects of this because I think there are just too many to cover. Like I said, we're going to hit some of the high points, and then we're going to talk about some themes and other things. So to kick things off at the beginning of last week, we saw the new executive order that was issued by the U.S., which was focused primarily on the two regions of eastern Ukraine that Russia recognizes independent, Donetsk and Luhansk. Those two, the executive order and the related actions that were taken by the U.S. have effectively put in place an embargo with respect to those regions. They're more or less treated the way that Crimea has been treated now for the past several years by the U.S. And all of the same kind of import-export bans and new investment bans with those regions are in effect. So that was sort of at the beginning of the week. There were a couple of SDN designations that targeted a couple of large Russian banks that came also on the heels of that. VEB and PSB were the two that were targeted, and then a handful of so-called Russian elites. And this has been a theme all along of the U.S. The U.S. strategy is to signal that Putin and his inner circle were going to suffer as a result of any aggression. There was also further restrictions on Russia's sovereign debt that kind of extended what was put in place previously. And also near and dear to our hearts, there were the waiver with respect to the Nord Stream 2 AG sanctions that had been announced last week was rescinded. And that means that Nord Stream 2 AG itself is now blocked, as is its CEO, pursuant to the actions that were taken last year by the U.S. A number of general licenses and FAQs issued in response in relation to all of those actions. Those were sort of let's call that the kind of early part of the week actions. And then in the first sort of full tranche, a couple of days later, we have much broader actions against the Russian financial sector, in particular, the two largest banks in Russia, Sberbank, which was not in fact added to the SDN list. It was though cut off from the U.S. financial system, cannot deal in dollars anymore due to the correspondent and account payable sanctions that have been imposed, but not fully blocked. And then VTB Bank, which is in fact now subject to blocking. A number of other large Russian banks also now subject to blocking sanctions. And then a number of other institutions in Russia, both financial and in key sectors, subject to debt and equity restrictions under what is now the new Directive 3 under EO 14024. Those also went into effect later in the week as well. And then some more Russian elites sanctioned at the end of the week. Putin himself and the Russian and was also sanctioned. And then over the weekend, big news that and something that we had handicapped as not terribly likely at the outset that certain Russian banks were going to be taken off the Swiss system, and that trickled out over the weekend. The U.S. and European allies making clear that that was the intention. We still don't have the names of the banks. That hasn't been sort of fully formalized, finalized yet, but that came out over the weekend. And then today, on Monday the 28th, the news that the Russian central bank and a couple of other critical Russian financial entities were going to be, again, not subject to blocking, but under what is a new Directive 4. All U.S. person transactions with those entities were going to be prohibited, essentially, in the absence of OFAC authorization. That is a complete and drastic oversimplification of what has happened, but a quick run through of the high points that I have. I may have missed a few things in there, but those are at a high level. That's what we're dealing with on the sanction side. Obviously, a lot of general licenses, FAQs, some regs that have come out in the past week. The new executive order I mentioned a week ago targeting the new regions in the DNR and the LNR in Ukraine. So let me pause there and let me ask you, Mr. O'Toole, and then I think I'm going to set you up for what I know is going to be your likely first point. What is the biggest thing in your mind that you have seen from this kind of initial wave, tsunami I called it before, of sanctions that have been imposed this past week? What is sort of your biggest takeaway? What are you most surprised by? What are you most interested in terms of the approach that's been taken by the U.S. and allies over the course of this first week that we've
Well,
seen?
I think you set it up there by mentioning and the allies, but I think that to me the biggest takeaway from this is just the level of strategery that has gone into this plan, and what I mean by that is so this is an attempt at shock and awe through sanctions, which we've never seen on this scale before. It's an attempt to essentially respond to a military attack that was designed to essentially invade another country and take it over as quickly as possible, with an attempt to stop it in some sense through sanctions by launching a lightning strike that's designed to cripple the Russian economy, the likes of which we've never seen. And what I mean by that is it's very targeted, but it's coming from all directions. And so it's not just the US, but it's the US and the UK and the EU and Australia and Canada and Japan and New Zealand, all of them coming at the same time, just kind of aimed directly at the Russian financial system, the ability of the Russian government to obtain revenue in any way whatsoever, designed to knock out the ruble, and then designed to send a message to Putin's biggest supporters that if they continue down this road, they will basically not be able to do anything outside of Russia, or certainly in the West, for the foreseeable future and maybe forever. And there is, I think one of the things that I've heard about this plan is that it does leave out the oil and gas industry. I would say a couple of things about that. First, not so much, because although the oil and gas sanctions have not expanded against Russia in a huge way since the last time, you can't buy anything from a Russian oil and gas company without running into the financial sector sanctions. I would say that it's a kind of, yes, that's true, but also go ahead.
It's maybe a backdoor way to get at the oil and gas industry, right? It's not. We talked earlier about, well, maybe Gazprom and Lukoil and some of these other massive entities would be in the crosshairs here. Clearly, the judgment was made. Let's not do that initially, and do what you're talking about. And we'll see. But it certainly, the early signs are that that's having a big impact.
Yeah, and with respect to it does leave some room to increase if that's the road that they decide to go down. But I think it was also designed to do as much damage to the Russian economy while doing as little harm as possible to the Western economies. And what I mean by that is, so the West, didn't want to create oil price shocks around the world. It's had somewhat of that effect anyway, but they didn't want to target the oil and gas industry, I think, because they were trying to aim directly at the Russian financial sector without trying to create, or with trying to minimize the shocks to the energy sector, and not the Russian energy sector, but the world energy sector. Whether that will work remains to be seen, but that's kind of what I keep going back to, is this was a coordinated, consolidated strategy among lots of different allies that is just remarkable in the level of planning and forethought that went into it. Again, that doesn't mean it'll work, but it does mean that they have really thought about what they want to do, and they've actually managed to get a lot of different actors together to try and do it.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts just on the back of that. One is, we've never really seen an economy as large or sophisticated as Russia's that's been targeted in this way by economic sanctions in this kind of comprehensive manner, right? We just have not seen that. The countries that are most associated with these types of measures are smaller in scope and scale and complexity, and oftentimes have been sort of hampered by sanctions for sometimes for years and years and years. And this is just something that's totally different. When just a few years ago, it's hard to imagine that this would have been on the table, right, with respect to somebody, a country like Russia, especially given the close connectivity that it has to Europe and the economy of major major countries and economies in Europe. And that goes to your point about the coordination here and the fact that this has been a theme all along of the Biden administration sanctions policy is to coordinate closely with allies. And that is something that they had telegraphed for months that they were doing with respect to Russia and Ukraine. And that is something clearly that has happened and has happened at least initially to good effect, it seems, in terms of really trying to, buttress the ability of Russia to find, convenient or quick outs here. I think you've already alluded to the fact that, the what's happening with the ruble, what's happening with inflation in Russia, what's happening in this is just within the past few days. Of course, this is already the response because, effectively now it's not necessarily the case, but effectively they are being, walled off from the global financial system in sort of targeted ways. Again, to the point I made early at the beginning when I went through my quick overview, Sparebank, not an SDN. So blocking obligations, blocking prohibitions do not attach to Sparebank. However, the Directive 2 that is now that they are now subject to requires that U.S. correspondent and payable through accounts have to terminate. So they are now there's no U.S. dollar transacting that's going to be happening for Sparebank anymore, at least not unless it's illicit and through some other source. It's not going to be through the United States anymore. So, so that's that's new. That's a new approach. That's a little different. That's a little more targeted. That's a little more nuanced. And so you're correct. Like we shall see how this all works. But it's not it's again, it's a little more of let's move with some precision here to impose as much pain as possible and refrain from imposing as much pain on ourselves and our close allies as we can, at least in the short term. Now, how things play out over time will be interesting to see. One thing to note is that many of these actions have relatively short wind down periods and wind down licenses associated with them. Sometimes we see, more than 30 days. We see broader kind of lanes for companies or entities to deal with the impact of big, earth-shattering sanctions. Here, it's a relatively compact timeline on many of these measures. Not all of them. Some of them are a little longer, but many of them 30 days or less. And so it'll be interesting to see how that all works and how that plays out here in the coming days and months. But to your point, if people can't get paid to do business with Russia, then they're not going to do business with Russia, regardless of or the ways that that's going to happen are going to be there's going to have to be sort of new avenues, new supply lines that are put together to understand how that can really work and how that's going to play out. And again, the Europeans have given this a lot of thought already because they've been worried about their energy supply and various other just interdependence that they have with Russia. But it'll be fascinating to see how this plays out in um, in in practical terms over the next couple weeks and months. And I think one thing that you and I have talked about, which again I'll set you up to talk about because this is your you were the one that's sort of brought this up I know a few times already with clients, is that it's striking to me and to us that we're not seeing reliance on CAATSA authorities here. We're not seeing reliance on or reference to at all secondary sanctions authorities when it comes to the measures that have been taken in the past week, which is a striking change from what we saw, in the past several years with regard to anything Russia related, and certainly with regard to Iran, anything Iran related, which is very heavily focused on the secondary sanctions impact and trying to scare away essentially parties from friendly countries. And to your point on the allied response and the coordinated response, seems pretty clear to us that that's just not deemed to be necessary by the U.S. at this point, given the way that everybody is in close alignment on how to respond here.
Yeah, I mean, so secondary sanctions have long been an irritant to our allies in the sense that, the US will impose sanctions and then say, and oh, by the way, allies, even for transactions that don't concern us and are beyond our jurisdiction, we're going to sanction those too by cutting anybody in your countries off from the US financial system who does things with the sanctioned country we don't like.
Or at least threaten that, which is sort of equivalent to basically, it just makes things that much more
And
difficult
and
to
it's an
to
irritant because you have countries who are saying this is beyond U.S. jurisdiction. Now, there's a theory as to why it's not, but it certainly is controversial overseas. That approach really does, it's almost glaring in its absence here, in the sense that there are CATSA authorities that could apply to this that are not cited in the executive orders that President Biden has signed. That we'll talk about the export controls later, but they have carve outs for the allies under the theory that the allies are going to impose their own export controls. And so what has happened here, and we'll see if the other countries back it up, but they seem to be. The movement on SWIFT seems to have been driven out of Europe. The central bank movements seem to have been driven out of Europe. Boris Johnson was saying over the weekend that the plan was to crush the ruble, and that plan seems to have at least in part come from overseas. So in this regime, unlike Iran, or unlike Syria, or unlike even Venezuela, what you have is the U.S. imposing, the U.S. basically taking on U.S. nexus transactions, but leaving rest of the world transactions to the allies to deal. UK deals with UK, EU deals with EU, and so on and so on. And that's something that we've never seen. And we've talked, one of our themes throughout this podcast has been that multilateral sanctions work better. But this will really put it to the test, because we've never seen a multilateral program like this, even in circumstances where there are there is some multilateral coordination. Usually the U.S. sanctions are much more aggressive than anybody else's. Right now, the plan, at least as best I can tell, and the EU is a little slower to act because it's got more procedural requirements than OFAC has, but at least as best we can tell, it looks like the rest of the world sanctions are going to be at least as strong in the U.S. in many instances, and that's pretty remarkable given that how much more connected Europe is to Russia than the U.S. is.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that another topic that we've talked about endlessly for the past 2 years, quite frankly, Nord Stream 2, Germany came to the decision on their own to decertify the project, ensuring that at least for the foreseeable future, that is not coming online. And, members of Congress and others here in the US were of the mind that we could sanction Nord Stream 2 into submission. That's not really obviously what happened. I think circumstances kind of, took hold. And because I think of the multilateral approach and the coordinated approach, the Germans eventually got on board with the idea that they had to act to stand in the way of that. So, a similar theme there in terms of where we kind of netted out, or have netted out at least for the time being, based on this approach. And again, to be clear, we're not sort of touting this as a victory by any stretch for this approach, for the Biden administration, or anything else. That is not the case necessarily. Time is going to tell how effective this is going to be. For anybody who listened to the last episode we recorded, we were talking about the void that China was ready to fill with respect to everything Russia related. Although, China's in an awkward position because they seem to be, I think, on the one hand, not too pleased with what Russia's doing, but on the other hand, don't want to speak out too harshly against their good friends in Russia, and so they're kind of, laying back a little bit, but certainly seem to be willing to step in and take the economic benefit to the extent that they can. But again, to the point that we raised the last time, perhaps given the way that the world has united to really, act in the face of the Russia's aggression in Ukraine, maybe that would embolden the U.S. or others to act with respect to China if they're too brazen here in terms of what they attempt to do to sort of either benefit themselves or alleviate the pain on behalf of Russia. So that'll be really fascinating to see.
Well, you raised China, and I think it's a really good point, and I think it may explain the energy kind of carve out, for lack of a better term, from these sanctions. You know, uh, for the most part, most of the sanctions programs, certainly Venezuela, Iran, Syria to some extent, are targeted at oil, and they've been very porous. And part of the reason they have is because oil is a commodity that can be moved around the world. You don't need to send it through wires that people can monitor. It doesn't go through. You don't have to send the oil through New York if you're transacting in dollars necessarily. And so it's something that is I think, while it can be, you can impose sanctions and you can certainly slow down the flow of oil, it's really hard to stop it. And in the long term, you just usually end up raising prices, but eventually a secondary market develops for oil. And China has bought a lot of Iranian oil even since the secondary sanctions have been in place. And I think the thinking on oil was probably like, it's certainly not going to be that effective. There'll be a lot of holes in that those sort of sanctions, and they're slow. Whereas the financial sector sanctions, I mean, as OFAC has really perfected them over time, they are very they're much less porous. There are a lot there are a lot, it's much more difficult to move money around without using the financial system. Now that doesn't mean that it's impossible. There is an entire, Chinese financial system that can be used, but it's not. Russia isn't that connected to it. My last read of this was that Russia reserves in RMB like 13%. So they really weren't, and that has increased over the last few years. So even that number is recent. But so that using the financial system is really where the strengths are from a sanctions perspective, and so that's really where these sanctions have focused. And again, I don't know. I'm not saying that they will necessarily be effective, but I think what the the U.S. and the allies have done is take what they've seen has been the proven most effective sanction tool and the one that works most quickly, and tried to make it impose the most aggressive financial sanctions regime that we've ever seen.
And I think that the thing to bear in mind that Tim and I are reminded of constantly and have been reminded of constantly over the last week is the idea that the global financial community, in particular the Western financial community, was ready for this in many ways. They were the most ready of anybody, I would say, of what could be coming. And they are the most ready to spring into action, to put the clamps down, to comply quickly, and to adjust their risk tolerance to perhaps close to zero with respect to most of what is going to be touching Russia at this point, and to serve effectively as a policing mechanism on this. And that's exactly what Tim is talking about. And the idea that even if non-U.S. entities or even U.S. entities who might feel that they have a pathway to be still do legal business in parts of Russia or with certain entities in Russia, the cost and the difficulty and the that is going to take has just been ratcheted up just by untold amounts in the last week, to the extent that there are going to be plenty of rational actors out there who are going to look at the Russian market now and say it's not worth the juice is not worth the squeeze, for lack of a less cliched way to put it. But that's the reality, and that's what I think was everybody was hoping to achieve here, or all the policymakers are hoping to achieve here. But that is definitely a reality, and that's a difference between, I'm putting aside people who are just trying to sort of figure things out, maybe wind things down and step away, but anybody who's committed kind of beyond the immediate near term to stay. We want to stay in Russia. We want to continue to do business there. The degree of difficulty and the complexity has just gone up considerably.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that the financial sector is the area where I think sanctions can be the most effective is because of one of the things that we've talked about before, this over compliance. That is, that the financial sector really, alone among the sectors, I think, around the world, if you want to give a broad generalization as opposed to talking about anecdotes. I mean, it does tend to have the financial companies tend to have much larger compliance staffs, be much more risk averse than other companies in terms of the sorts of business that they'll do. And so by imposing these sectors on the financial section or by sanctions on the financial sector of Russia, you've enlisted all of these compliance teams from all of the banks around the world to really enforce that in a way that OFAC doesn't have its own enforcement officers, it doesn't have its own investigative capabilities. It's kind of enlisted in this sanctions this huge group of compliance officials from banks around the world in a way that with oil and gas and other sectors you just don't have those sorts of efficient enforcement mechanisms.
Right. Not to mention the fact that, we are aware that, um, there was a lot of pre-baking of this by OFAC and Treasury and other officials in the U.S. government who were doing roadshows and talking to key groups to sort of let it be known that, the sky was about to fall potentially, and that everybody needed to be aware of that and be vigilant, ready for it, and ready to hop to it and comply with whatever the U.S. decided to and its allies decided to cook up, because this by all of the discussions we've had, by all of the public reporting and the signaling that has happened, we didn't know until just a few days ago precisely what this was going to look like. And that maybe leads me to a final point that we can talk about before we shift to export controls, which is, I know that my clients who were trying to get out in front of this, some of whom had spent a lot of time and effort and energy, are trying to game plan and have contingency plans in place and be ready for this. They have still struggled, quite frankly, some of them with trying to figure out exactly how to navigate all of this in the last couple of days, because I think that's not, that takes into account the fact that there was a lot that was left on the table here that did not get implemented. To Tim's point, there was nothing explicitly targeting the big actors in the oil and gas industry. There was nothing targeting big actors in other big revenue generating sectors of the Russian economy. This is really it's almost exclusively targeted the financial sector and Russian elites. That's really it. And there's a lot of spillover and sort of cascading effect in many other aspects of the Russian economy and the global economy, but that's really where the pain was targeted, at those actors. That's it. And so I know that I can speak for myself and I can speak for Tim by saying that I've basically been on the phone day in, day out, 24/7 for the last week, fielding calls and helping to walk through, well, what do we do next, or what do we have to prioritize, and what do we need to worry about, and how do we assess this or this or this? What do we have to pause everything indefinitely? Can we take, is a week enough time, 2 weeks enough time to kind of get our arms around what this is going to mean for us, etc. And there was an article that just appeared today, I think in Bloomberg or Law 360 or one of the publications, that was basically all about how sanctions lawyers are are too busy, and quite frankly Tim and I were too busy to respond to that article. Like, we both got contacted, right, and I didn't have time to comment for the article because I was on the phone for 3 straight days. So
if you're commenting in that article, you're not busy enough.
Yeah, I literally wrote the guy back at midnight and I'm like, sorry, catch me next time, I don't have time to talk to you. And that's literally what the article was about. It's like, so it's pretty astonishing, and what this is wreaking around the globe. And I guess just I'll throw it to you, just for any kind of, say you're a man of wisdom and sage advice, if there's anything, I mean, I should also tell people that as we speak, we are finalizing a 15-page update on that will comprehensively cover everything that's happened in the last week. We're not going to try to do that here because, again, we don't want to put everybody to sleep.
If we look like we're typing, we're
not, but we don't want to put you all to sleep. Like, we need sleep ourselves. But just any kind of quick thoughts on sort of what this is doing to folks right now before we pivot to export controls?
Well, you do raise a really good point about the fact that people are still struggling to comply when a lot of this was predicted. I mean, we predicted most of this, maybe not all of it, but the real attack on the financial sector we predicted. what we didn't predict, and what I think is really making people struggle at this point, is how fast this has come into play and how coordinated it's been with the allies, and how it's gone from like within a week from Russia being a fairly lightly sanctioned country to one where we're just trying to struggle to keep up with how many sanctions have been imposed on Russia, and really revising that every couple of hours. And so, I
Yeah.
mean, I've never seen anything like this. And I think that's the speed and just kind of it coming from all different directions on the financial sector is what is kind of was not predicted or predictable, I think.
The other thing that I would caution everybody is don't by any stretch think that this is the end. Whenever you hear this podcast, which will probably be the first couple days of March, whenever you read our client alert or whatever your outside law firm's client alert on this topic, be mindful that it may already be outdated because there is so the pace here and the is so rapid in terms of the changes. So we are obviously living and breathing this 24/7, as are a lot of people right now, but don't be lulled into some false sense of thinking, okay, well now we know precisely what we're dealing with. This is in some ways just the whole scenario here has become a chaos agent for the entire kind of global sanctions compliance community, and everybody is just having to burn the candle at both ends to try to make sure that you're staying on top of the latest and the greatest here. So I would expect that to continue. I don't think that by any stretch we're done. And I think that, for the next at least few weeks, if not few months, I would expect that there's going to be a lot of activity here. And so keep eyes open, ears open, and just keep a watch as to what's going on. We thought about doing an emergency pod last week, which it's a good thing we didn't, because it would have been totally overcome by events, and we would have been, not have even covered like half of what's happened in the last 5 days. So anyway, just a word of warning on that is that I think everybody's got to stay vigilant and stay, we will. I'm sure our next episode here will be a continuation of this one, and but just be aware of that.
Yeah, I think the speed with which this is developing,
Yeah.
and the unpredictability in terms of where the next move is going to come from is part of the design.
Yeah. So with that, let's pivot a little bit to the other big piece of this, which is export controls, which again, to Tim's point, has been just as well coordinated, it seems, as the sanctions between the U.S. and its close allies. I think there are kind of a couple of big issues here that I'll just kind of set up and then throw it to Tim. So there's the drastically expanded licensing requirements on the U.S. side with respect to Russia, which, until just a week ago were pretty light. Many, and if not most items, did not require licensing to Russia. Now that's not the case. There's also a presumption of denial with respect to most license applications that are going to Russia for U.S. items. That's number one. Number two is the two new foreign direct product rules, which drastically expand the scope of foreign produced items that are going to Russia. One which covers the entire country, one which covers Russian military and users. I'll let Tim talk about how there are some significant carve-outs there for allied countries who are imposing similar restrictions, but that's another big one. And then there's the shift in approach, or the expansion again, of how the U.S. rules now and BIS is now treating military and users. There's a movement of the previously listed MEUs over to the entity list. There's an expansion of what that covers. And so yeah, I'll stop there and I'll sort of throw it to Tim and just sort of what your initial thoughts and reactions are on the export controls front.
So, here the breadth of the new export controls is pretty astounding. I mean, everything that had a unilateral control in categories 3 through 9, which is a pretty huge swath of goods. I mean, basically, you've got electronics, computers, telecom and information security, lasers, sensors, navigation, avionics, marine, and aerospace. All of those now, if there were unilateral controls where a license was not required for Russia, 58 new ECCNs now require a license for Russia. The only thing that's left out, are 0, 1, and 2, and that's nuclear materials, and materials processing. So pretty much if it's a good and it's not a nuclear good,
and ER 99.
an EAR 99. I mean, but from the Commerce Control
Yeah,
List,
yeah,
that's it's pretty much everything that is kind of a good that has any sort of controls on it. And these were the most minimally controlled ECCNs. Now EAR 99 is not included, so that's a big carve out. But if it's on the Commerce Control List, it now requires a license to Russia. There's a presumption of denial, which is I think will be very strictly enforced here. And then most of the license exceptions are gone too. So you really it's going to create huge restrictions on what can go to Russia. Now there are the carve outs, which were kind of interesting for items that would otherwise be subject to some of these new kind of very strict foreign direct product rules, some of the de minimis calculations. Those were also really interesting as well, because and I guess I should back up. This is a draft new rule that
right.
purports to be effective as of last week, but won't even be finalized or published until this week, which is also quite odd and I would say potentially unenforceable, at least during this 1 week period. But I wouldn't advise anybody to ignore it, but I do question whether or not a draft rule that's not published yet is actually enforceable. But again, I wouldn't advise anybody to test that. But that rule has essentially within it, or at least the draft, says that for certain countries, and it's basically all of the NATO countries, EU countries, UK, Japan, Canada, the countries you would expect, those countries are planning their own export controls that are similar to these, and therefore some of the new rules don't apply to goods from those countries. And so, for example, like we're not going to have strict de minimis rules in those countries in the way that we could, because we expect it won't matter, right? I mean, who needs to have the EAR applied to something with 25% controlled content when you can have the UK rules, which are the same, apply to them? Why make anybody go through the de minimis calculation? And so certain materials that otherwise would be counted in that calculation are excluded at this point. You've got different foreign direct product rules in those countries than in other countries, to make sure that it's basically, kind of like with the sanctions. If you're in the US, if you've got a good that's clearly subject to the EAR, then US restrictions will apply. But for a UK product, the UK restrictions will apply, because at least in theory they're going to be the same anyway. So you might as well not make it so complicated.
Yeah, it's it's I would say that the biggest thing that I would say. So to Tim's point, I think the multilateral nature of the approach here, and the faith that the U.S. is putting in its allies to hold up their end of the bargain here is a marked departure from what we've seen before. The fact that the two new foreign direct product rules are not going to apply for goods produced in some of these countries that Tim just mentioned. Just a pretty remarkable kind of change in approach, I guess, from what has happened historically. Not to mention the fact that we've seen the special Huawei foreign produced direct product rule a couple of years ago, and we spent a lot of time talking about that. Now there's rules that are applying to the entire country of Russia, which depending on how supply arrangements and supply chains are set up, could be quite an onerous task for folks to try to understand and comply with if they are going to continue to produce and supply Russia. For obvious reasons, this was set up, and we talked about this in prior episodes, the idea that, again, for example, semiconductors that are produced in Taiwan, that is being targeted here. They don't want the chips that are produced in Taiwan to be able to flow to Russia, to be able to support the military ambitions of Russia, to support the aerospace and maritime and other key technology sectors of the Russian economy. That is clearly what is intended here, which is why the scoping of this is done in the way that it is. That being said, for multinationals, and I've already had a number of these conversations, I know Tim has as well, it's still going to be quite a tall task for folks who are planning to at least continue to supply Russia, or at least complete existing orders or contemplated orders that were in place, to ensure that they're doing that in a manner that is fully compliant with the new rules, that will take into account the EU controls that are going into place, the UK controls, these other countries, and factor in whatever US licensing requirements might be in place, which again are far more extensive than they were just a few days ago. So as a practical matter, doing that review, ensuring that that is something that is being done in a fully compliant way, that's going to take some resources for companies that are, committed to trying to follow through on these orders. I will say that it's clearly not the intention of the Commerce Department and the U.S. government to necessarily cut off the Russian people from all Western, items that are not of some kind of strategic importance to the Russian government. That being said, we know that there's going to be some impact on that. There's going to be some lessening of imports on that end from Russia. It is going to have some impact on the sort of the Russian civilian population, no doubt. But that being said, I think again in the way that this was sort of targeted, it's meant not to be kind of a full, uh, you know, embargo. Obviously, we talked about that. We talked about that as obviously something that had been floated or discussed as sort of the most drastic of rules that could be put into effect. Again, there's room to grow here. As extensive as these new rules are, there is room to grow. There's room to extend. There's room to do more. And so I do think that for now, this is um, it's a pretty strong initial change to the rules that is going to have impact. It's not going to probably be felt as immediately as the economic sanctions side of things. But I think there are a lot of people right now trying to figure out how they can comply with this, whether they can, especially given the presumption of denial that is hanging over everything. I would note that there are Commerce makes a point of obviously calling out that there are going to be case by case review given obviously the license applications. Um, they're expecting a drastic uptick in license applications. Not surprisingly, if it's humanitarian in nature, if it's for a U.S. based, if it's a wholly owned sub of a U.S. based company, or if it's a multinational that's based in a U.S. allied country, if it's any health and safety considerations, any number of those kind of considerations, there might be good reasons or a sort of good policy arguments to be made as to why licenses should be granted, at least in the short term, if not over a longer period of time, to get certain controlled items into Russia. But those are going to have to be thought through very carefully. We've already started doing that on behalf of a number of clients that are looking at this carefully. That is something I would imagine a lot of people are thinking through right now. So it's just going to be a lot of effort to get sort of to get this done and to potentially get these exports into Russia going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that, because I think those are all really good points, is just the change to the military end user and end use rule with respect to Russia is also pretty significant in the sense that, and understandable given the policy reasons for implementing these changes. But the normal MEU restrictions only apply to certain products that are on one of the supplements to Part 744. These rules now, the restrictions on sales to Russian military end users, which is a broad category, or end uses, apply to all items subject to the EAR with really limited exceptions, food and medicine being one, and then a couple of low-level computer devices being the other, basically phones and computers, but certain types that are 5A992 and 5D992. And so it is a huge restriction to the Russian military. Pretty much, you can't sell them a pencil anymore, and for understandable reasons, and that without a license, and that is a big change. And given the expansive reach of military end user, it could also be significant.
Yeah, no, agree with that. So um, there's going to be a lot more to talk about there in terms of what's coming next and how that's going to get tweaked. I also expect that, there was a fact sheet that was issued by BIS, I think perhaps when the final version of the rule is issued or perhaps soon thereafter. much like when the military and use and end user rules were expanded a couple years ago. There was kind of an FAQ document. I would expect we're gonna get something like that in the coming weeks, to help sort of flesh out some of the gray areas here that we're all starting to bump into on that. But for now, I think that's all we want to say about that. So we will. So let's leave. So again, that was about 45 minutes on Russia, all things Russia. We could probably keep talking for the next several hours, but we're going to stop ourselves there for now. We will obviously be back to this on the next episode as well. But we will pause for the lightning round sign effect and one topic in the lightning round today. So it's a truly lightning round, which is DOJ's China initiative. So last week, in the midst of all the chaos unfolding in Ukraine and the global response to that, the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olson, gave a speech wherein he outlined the review that had occurred under his watch since taking over in that position of DOJ's China initiative, and acknowledging that there needed to be a change made, and that the China initiative, as it existed and as it was conceived of under former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, would be no longer, and acknowledging the concerns about bias and stifling academic collaboration and research, and many of the other things that we've talked about and that observers have raised as problem areas with respect to the China initiative as it took shape and as it was implemented over the course of the last few years. That's not to say that they are dismissing all cases that were brought sort of under the umbrella of the China initiative. That is not the case necessarily. They are definitely standing behind a number of prosecutions that are still in progress right now, but effectively they are shelving the China initiative as it exists. What he said, one interesting thing that I'll talk to, and then I'll sort of tee up a reaction from Mr. O'Toole, who I know has strong feelings about this. So he said, he brought into the discussion sort of and contextualize other bad actors at the state level, Iran and Russia obviously being among the top there, and said, we need to have, our focus is not just China, it's all of these actors, and and we're not going to relent there. We're obviously going to continue to focus on all of that. But he did say, and this was the thing that I think that Tim and I talked about at length when we talked about the dismissal that came against the MIT professor a few weeks ago. Cases that are not necessarily tied to, that are talking about misstatements or false statements purportedly made on grant applications and things of that sort. Those just do not rise to the level of persons that are trying to abscond with or exfiltrate or steal sensitive U.S. technology, controlled technology, and items, and bring them back to China or other foreign countries, right? It's just, in our view, that's just not, that's not an apples to apples thing. And that's not to say that this has to be a one note approach, but I think clearly in the hierarchy of the pecking order, thinking about protecting those things is probably at the top of the list. And in fact, in the speech, Matt Olson said, top imperatives in terms of the shifting of approach here is to defend core national security interests and protect most sensitive information and resources. Protect economic security and prosperity, including key technologies and private information about American supply chains and industry. Those are the top two things he mentioned. So that sort of plays directly into what we talk about all the time and what we focus on all the time. And so that seems that the strategic reorientation would be a little bit more toward what we would expect and think would be perhaps a better use of DOJ resources in this regard, rather than bringing criminal cases against professors that may have omitted something on a grant application. So I will throw this to you, Mr. O'Toole, for your reactions, and I will tee up one final thought, which is, among the more cynical out there, they would say, well, this is really no change. It's just a rebranding, or it's kind of they're just sort of repainting. They're going to continue. DOJ is going to do the same thing they've been doing. They're just kind of, they're kind of tucked their tail between their legs, and they're going to, they're wise enough to know that they shouldn't call it the China initiative anymore, but they're really going to be doing the same thing. What would you say to sort of what Matt Olson said, and to the sort of more cynical views out there that this is really no change at all?
Well, first of all, good riddance to the China initiative. I think whenever you have an initiative that focuses on a country, the risk of spillover to kind of focusing on ethnicity or some other immutable characteristic is there, and I think this initiative showed that. But I think almost as bad is the spillover effect to crimes or charges that don't have anything to do with what your goal is. So I even if it's rebranding, I think branding matters because branding tells you what it is that you want to focus on. And so what I would respectfully submit to DOJ is that they ought to really focus on trade theft and theft by anyone of any foreign adversary for sure, foreign rival for sure of important U.S. technology. And I think I even have a name for what they ought to call this. I think they should call it Stop the Steal. And I think that would be a new name.
Oh, this is what happens when we're punchy and we haven't slept in a week. Tim's got all the jokes. Trademark, Timothy O'Toole.
Stop the Steal initiative, and then people would keep their eyes on the ball. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's an appropriate note to end on. For those loyal listeners out there, we hope you were as amused by that final thought as we are. Okay, that's all we have for this episode. We will no doubt be back in March with more on Russia, and as things continue to unfold, maybe we will have to do an emergency episode at some point in the future. But for now, you will hopefully all have this one first few days of March. It will encapsulate our thoughts, at least on the first week of what's gone on here in terms of the global response to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And like we said, there's no end in sight here, so we will catch our breath, and we will be back again the next time to talk about this further. So until then, everybody stay well and stay sanctions free.
Stay well, everybody.
This podcast was produced by Heartcast Media.